Today is June 28, 2022. This is Danny Bulford with the Mounties for Freedom, and this is episode 3 of the Mounties for Freedom podcast. Today, it is my absolute distinct pleasure to be interviewing the Honourable former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, Brian Peckford. Brian Peckford received a Bachelor of Education degree, having also completed postgraduate work in English literature, education, psychology, and French literature. Prior to entering politics, he was a high school teacher in rural Newfoundland. As one of Newfoundland's most committed and combative leaders, Mr. Peckford clashes with the federal government to wrest control of the province's natural resources, resulted in the groundbreaking Atlantic Accord of 1985, his greatest political triumph during the province's struggle for self-reliance in a post-Confederation era. The Atlantic Accord has become the template for all exploration and development of offshore oil and gas resources in Canada. Premier Peckford and his administrations are responsible for a few firsts, including the first aquaculture legislation, first Department of Environment, first pay equity policy, Fine Arts Council, first Status of Women Council, first community college system, and the first and only fine arts degree program in building at the Grenfell campus at Memorial University in Corner Brook. In 1982, Premier Peckford received the Vanier Award as an outstanding young Canadian. That same year, he was sworn to the Privy Council of Canada by Her Majesty the Queen. In 2008, Premier Peckford was chair of a federal government-appointed expert panel to review federal chronic disease policy, especially diabetes, and to present a report to the federal health minister. Premier Peckford retired from public life in 1989 and established his own consulting business, serving government and business clients in North America and Europe. Mr. Peckford is currently, as of 2012, a director of Strongbow Exploration Incorporated. So, sir, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me this afternoon. It's my pleasure to have you, such a Canadian icon here with me today.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
So, Premier Peckford, I'll just get right into the meat of these prepared questions. I guess I'll lead off with, when I was looking at some of your background, I saw that there were 3 particular political personalities, you would say, or historical people that you have a level of admiration for: Joseph Smallwood, John Crosbie, and René Lévesque. And it seems like the overall theme of all of them is that you have an admiration for the fact that they weren't afraid to stand up for what they believed was their ideals. And even if it carried with them a level of controversy. Is that accurate?
No.
No? Okay. All right.
Smallwood is not one of my admirers. I mean, I don't admire Joseph Smallwood.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's my mistake.
Okay. John Crosbie, to a degree. René Lévesque, notwithstanding his view on Canada, perhaps was the most was one of the other people that I admire a lot in Canadian, who's around during my time, was a little known premier of Prince Edward Island, Agnes MacLean, who was a veteran, was Veteran Affairs Minister under Diefenbaker, goes back a long while, and then later became premier of Prince Edward Island and was part of the patriation process for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1981. But John Crosbie, to a degree, but only to a degree, on those areas where you spoke up, but in other areas he didn't stand up, which is not well known. And René Lévesque, because he did have beliefs and he did have principles and he did stand by them. And outside of his personal vision, which I'm not sure whether it was his personal vision of those around him, but he did stand up for what he believed in most often. And I got to know him fairly well.
All right, thank you. Because where I was going with that question is that it appears as though, if you were to take a devil's advocate approach, one might argue that the current government under Prime Minister Trudeau he has taken a very firm stance on what are his beliefs and ideologies. And he's made a number of controversial decisions of his own. And so I was wondering if you would speak to what your opinion of the current government currently is.
Well, I think, that the longer Justin Trudeau's in power, the more he's like his father. And I fought his father all the while that I was in politics. And so his view of the country is far more centralized, I think, than my view of the country. My view of the country is what's in the Constitution, the division of powers, the separation of powers, as they call it in the United States, and that the provinces have certain rights under the Constitution, exclusive jurisdiction, and so on. And so I would view Justin Trudeau as becoming more and more like his father, stubborn, and really looking to implant a more centralized authority upon the country than is warranted under the provisions of the Constitution.
Okay, and I think I've heard you speak to that before, how there's been this gradual transfer of power from members of parliament to the PMO and the Privy Council office. And I would like to come back to that at some point in the interview. But I guess what you have probably become best known for these last couple of years has been the fact that you are very vocally against some of the majority of the restrictions and mandates that have been imposed in regarding to COVID. And you've been a champion of the Charter of Rights because you're the last living signatory. Would you say that this could potentially be the most defining moment in your time in the political arena? I know you've had a very storied history in politics, but I mean this last 2 years has been an extremely difficult and divisive and defining moment in Canadian history. And I mean, you have been a major voice for the defense of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Yeah, I suspect that arguably it could be perhaps especially from a national point of view. If one took it from a more provincial point of view, then I guess things like the Atlantic Accord, like the provincial flag, which we didn't have a flag until I became premier. And of course, flags are great symbols for forever of a jurisdiction. So I guess if you style it in terms or frame it in terms of the national importance, I think this last 2 years quite likely could very well be viewed as a defining moment as it relates to me as a public figure in Canada. You know, this is a very sad day for me. Just happened coincidentally with what our interview, because Tamara Leash has been arrested again. Yeah. The leader of the truck convoy. I mean, they're chasing around looking for ways in which she can be arrested, it seems to me. I've just learned from my lawyers that there's a delay in my court case. It was supposed to be heard. It's ongoing in the courts. Case management and all of the arguments between the lawyers is going on, but the federal government asked for a delay. And the judge, I think wrongly, approved that delay. And so now it looks like my hearing will be the earliest October 31st and not September 25th. But the grounds under which this was done, I don't think were valid. So I'm very upset about that this morning, and about Tamara being arrested again. And of course, I'm to speak at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms George Jonas Award in Vancouver. There was one in Toronto, and there's another one in Vancouver on July the 13th. Where I'm supposed to be the keynote speaker, which of course Tamara is to be there. And of course, if she's in jail and she's not out by then, you know, that's a problem. And I've just learned that another event that I was to speak at has been canceled because of pushback locally. And so, you know, these three things together in the last several hours, you know, I just wrote back somebody before I came on with you, explaining these three things. And I said, you know, I keep thinking about that popular song, Slip Sliding Away. Yeah. That sounds very much like our nation is slip sliding away. And my own personal experiences are overwhelming that there is validity in that statement from a local school canceling my speech here in my own little city on Vancouver Island at the last minute, having agreed to it, to the local mayor refusing to allow me to make a presentation to his council on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to the local MLA, setting up conditions that were impossible to meet. And so therefore I couldn't present my presentation to the NDP Caucus of British Columbia, to the court now being delayed, to members of the convoy being arrested. You are quite familiar with a lot of this stuff from a national sort of point of view, and also from a local point of view with me. And so and of course the government's refusing, all of the governments of Canada refusing to refer their mandates under the pandemic to their highest court, which they have the power to do to determine whether it was constitutional. They just, blatantly and arrogantly wouldn't even answer. Most of them, they've never answered my request. Why won't you do this? You have the power to do this, and therefore relieve a lot of Canadians about whether in fact what you're doing is constitutional or not. They refuse to do that. And I've written them since and asked them, would they entertain a citizens-led inquiry into what happened over the last 2 years to see whether it was necessary, one, and two, whether it was constitutional. Of course, once again, they have all refused or not answered me at all. So the nature of our society as expressed through the premiers and the prime ministers, just not the prime minister, as much as I've been I go back to 1980 and 81 as it relates to the Trudeaus. And as much as I object to all of the things both Pierre Elliott have been doing, we must not lose sight of the fact that all of the premiers of Canada and the leaders of the territories have performed over the last 2 year acts, which in my view are completely and unadulteratedly unconstitutional and violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, so that's something I always like to reaffirm as well, because almost all of the blame gets heaped on Justin Trudeau, but it's his federal government, it's every provincial government, whether they be conservative, liberal, NDP, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
They've all towed the line and done the exact same thing. And when you mentioned Tamara's arrest, I received a notification of that last night, and I was trying to gather information because I don't want to give opinions on without solid information. And it's my understanding she was arrested on a Canada-wide warrant. That's what's being reported in the news anyway, and that's consistent with what I had heard in regards to an alleged breach of a bail condition on a recognizance, which is a release document given before the judge with conditions of release. And so I've have a decent amount of experience with people being on bail conditions and breaching their conditions. I've encountered many people in my career, and this is just another clear example of how this is an abnormal practice from a policing point of view. I have never, ever seen a Canada-wide warrant issued for anything that wasn't an extremely serious offense. Like I'm talking about like a serious violent sexual assault, a murder, a matter of national security, armed robbery, definitely not a breach of a recognizance or an undertaking for that matter, and any kind of bail violation. And so it's just another key indicator to me that we are going in a very dangerous direction, and the mass of the population seems to be either oblivious or okay with it. And that's what's extremely concerning to me. And prior to this interview, as I was preparing, I had an interview playing in the background, listening to Dr. Julie Panesi with Professor Matthias Desmet from, I think he's from Belgium or the Netherlands.
Yes, Belgium.
Talking about mass formation, and the mass formation that's the precondition that needs to be set in order for a totalitarian regime to come to power. And man, it just, when you hear him lay out the conditions required for that to occur, that's exactly what we're living through. It's eerie. And I know one of the main driving factors behind why I chose what I did was because I have been paying attention to people who've been warning about that direction, like Jordan Peterson. And I've been listening and paying attention to people who are trying to raise the alarm bell about the direction of our country. And I had made a decision, a conscious decision, that I would never participate in the lie. I would not be part of the lie that would lead to such a degeneration of our democracy. And so what's happening to Tamara, in my point of view, from a former police officer standpoint, is not only is it completely abnormal, but it's absolutely political. It's not like, how could it possibly be in the public interest to arrest someone and transport them from Alberta all the way to Ontario for an alleged breach of a recognizance, when by the RCMP's own admission, it was not in the public interest to prosecute the Prime Minister for alleged fraudulent activity.
Right.
It's such a hypocritical double standard. I think a question I'll pose to you, you're the last living signatory of the charter, is what do you think the others would be, what would be their mindset about what's happening right now in Canada, the people that you collaborated with and negotiated with in order to develop the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
I gave a speech on the 20th anniversary of the Constitution Act, or the Charter, to the Canadian Legal Society of British Columbia in Vancouver 20 years ago. And in that speech, and I've been looking it up because I've been preparing my speech for the Justice Center, I said at the time in writing that I know for certain that the majority of the First Ministers and the officials that I dealt with when we were formulating the Constitution Act and the Reparation Act agreement, that by far the majority, if not all, would be absolutely horrified at what's happening today as it relates to how the Charter of Rights is being abused by the governments of the case. I remember in high school, we had a one-act play, and it was this person who was really smart, but who made a fatal mistake. And the last words of the little one-act play was, "I did not foresee it." Well, that's like me today and many others, some of whom are remaining silent, who are still alive. We did not foresee, we could not envisage a day when the leadership of this nation, both legally and politically and otherwise, have so misused, construed our laws, especially the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and how they have exercised their power and become very elastic in their definition of what it is this charter says. And I am absolutely astounded by this. And the majority of those First Ministers, Peter Lougheed, Bill Bennett, Alan Blakeney, Sterling Lyon, all of those Western premiers, I mean, were very, very strong on the thinking that by doing these things, that because it was constitutionalizing something. Remember, the Bill of Rights was a federal act. I keep saying in all my speeches, it was a federal act, and it only applied to federal jurisdiction. And Canada is not a federal jurisdiction state, right? It's a national state which has a constitution which says some things are federal and some things are provincial. Therefore, to get something that applies to the whole nation, you have to do it in the Constitution. That's why the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was put in the Constitution, because it was more permanent, more difficult to change, we thought at the time. Naive? I don't think we were. I think if the leadership of the country and the courts had properly interpreted the Charter from 1982 to now, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. But they have deliberately taken the opportunity on the legal side, Danny, on the legal side, the legal beagles saw this as an opportunity. I'm now convinced that since 1981-82, when the Constitution Act was passed, they saw this as an opportunity to enlarge the scope of the judiciary level of our system, okay, to enlarge its scope. That's what they've done. And they've done it now in spades in the last 2 years. The courts so far, at least, the lower courts so far have. There's one in Saskatchewan the other day ruled against the charter again. I haven't had a chance to read it, but it was anything like the Manitoba one. They don't even mention certain parts of the charter, like the supremacy of God or the rule of law, in interpreting the charter. They're ignoring actual parts of it. And so both the judiciary and the legal community, plus the political community, and they have bamboozled the rest of society into believing this is the way our nation should be going. And so therefore that brings right into the idea of mass psychosis that you just talked about in the interview that Julie had with the guy from Belgium. It feeds right into it. And when I talk to people in my own area right here where I am in Parksville, Vancouver Island, they have become convinced that what's happening is correct. And I'm right to, by the way, you know, what really troubled me was Marjorie Le Breton, former senator, resident of Ottawa. She was with Prime Minister Mulroney years ago in his office. I remember her. I remember talking to her. I remember emailing her after she became a senator. I heard her the other day come out and say how she quit a district association, conservative district association in the Ottawa area, because the member for the area was sympathetic towards the convoy, and she couldn't put up with this, and that this was a, you know, that these people like you and me who were in part of the convoy and were there in Ottawa, you know, were terrorists. We were bringing Ottawa to a standstill. We were destroying the country and all. This is a former advisor to Harper. This is a former employee of Mulroney's office. All people that I supported at the time. Right? All people that I supported at the time, coming out now and getting coverage, of course, and cementing the narrative, the false narrative that somehow you and I and others are trying to destroy the country. I mean, this is so dangerous. So, I mean, if Lougheed was around today, even Levesque was around today, and still part of the country, you know, these people, Angus MacLean from Prince Edward Island, right? John Buchanan from Nova Scotia, these people would be horrified about what has happened in the interpretation of what leadership means in this country, both through the law and through Parliament.
Well, I think what's happening, and I see this in media all the time, and I think reading through your response to David Lametti, the way he tweaks the wording of Section 1 of the Charter in his justification for what they did, right? Like he omits, I think,
yes,
you even
put justify in there.
Yeah, you even highlighted what a contrast, your statement versus the actual section. You know, so they root their statements in something that is, I'll call it true-ish, where it's they just include enough to make it appear credible to the population, and therefore people accept it as though it's fact, or that it's actually based in evidence and that it's justified. I mean, my experience throughout especially this last year, shame on me for not paying closer attention for the first year of the pandemic, but this last year, when I went looking for evidence, I didn't find hardly anything that was in support of what they were doing, restrictions and mandates wise. And yet, if you really wanted to look for yourself and take the time, there was plenty of expert testimony, like raising the alarm about all of it. And yet they will never, when questioned, they will never provide a straight answer. They will never provide any kind of detailed evidence to justify what they're doing. They just keep regurgitating these same talking points that are true-ish, like just enough of the legislation, or, you know, the talking point over and over again becomes accepted as fact.
Right. But how insulting it is to people like you, who was in law enforcement, and me, who was in helping to make the laws, to witness, for example, to give credence to what you just said, to more validity to what you just said, the public health orders of British Columbia, where here's what they do to further make your point. They mention the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in some of their public health orders, but they don't go on to substantiate anything to meet the tests of demonstrably justifying in a free and democratic society. They think, this is how insulting and how arrogant they are, they think all they have to do is mention the words Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and somehow that justifies what they're doing. This is the most elementary, this is grade 4 stuff. To think that I'm going to accept because they mention the document, that therefore they're justified in interpreting in a way which is completely contrary to what the meaning of the document is.
Well, and you mentioned the Bill of Rights earlier. I've had people bring that up to me over and over again, as though that's what we should be using. And I always specify, like, look, that's not how this works, right? Like that's definitely not how the system operates, right? Like my police training, no one even mentioned the Bill of Rights. It was all about charter, 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 charter. If you're pushing the boundaries on a breach of the charter, you're wandering into gray territory. Everything that we were taught as police officers when it came to powers of arrest, search and seizure, as opposed to detention, it was all guided by charter. Every decision you see come from the courts is all supposed to be guided by the charter. And so where did we lose our way? How did we become so complacent and let this just steamroll over top of us?
Yep.
And I think, if you tie in the idea of the mass formation and the talking points repeated over and over again by the media and the government, it's very easy for people and combine that with a lack of education in the schools about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Exactly.
I think that's why we have gotten into this position. It's a overall population level responsibility that we have become complacent and we have not been civically engaged enough to prevent this from happening.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more with you. In doing my speech, I've had to go back, and there are a number of people said to me, well, were you always in favor of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? There's a document under my name, August 1980. As Premier and Intergovernmental Affairs Minister for the government of Newfoundland at the time, we issued a document. This was very early on, 1980. Constitution Act was 2 years later. Reparation Agreement was a year and a half later, where we outlined our position on the constitutional discussions that were coming up. This is one of the first documents issued by any government in Canada. I still have the original copy of it. I kept a lot of these documents because I was always very, very interested in them, right? And so in that document, I make the point that we were totally in favor of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms going in the Constitution, because we knew then that was a national thing and not just a provincial or federal thing. But I did make the point, we made the point at the time, that whilst it was really, really important to put it in the Constitution, its lasting validity would be dependent upon the vigilance of the citizen, the accountability of the governments, the independence of the judiciary, and the rule of law. All of those four things now have come back to haunt us, because what we have not done is have an educated citizenry that therefore can assess whether our Constitution is being followed, right? One can question the accountability of the governments. They don't want to be accountable because they will not allow their mandates to go to the courts, as I asked them, would they do? And they said no, or ignored me completely. Right? The judiciary has been brought into question by decisions out of BC, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan as we speak, right? And the rule of law has been completely ignored, as one sees it interpreted in history, both in the jurisprudence of the United States and in Canada. It's very interesting that Judge Thomas, in bringing down his ruling on the firearms thing in the United States, emphasized over and over again in his ruling about, I must go back and look at the history of jurisprudence and how this was handled. History and precedent and so on is extremely important in the development of valid jurisprudence and in the rule of law. It has permanence. Permanence means you're looking at the history of it. That's what gives you permanence, right? And it was on that basis, one of the main bases by which he made his ruling and had the support of 5 other of the justices. I mentioned that not because he's in the United States or Canada, but as an idea, not because he's an American, not because he's anywhere, except here's a person who's well educated and is a judge somewhere on the planet who understands the importance of the rule of law and the history of a piece of legislation or the history of the Constitution and how it was interpreted. Well, in like manner, in 1980, August 1980, when the government of Newfoundland, under my signature, both as Premier and as Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, said that we support completely the Charter, but we even understood then, I had some really good people working for me as ministers at the time who were lawyers. A person who helped write this document, who's dead now, is the late Gerald Ottenheimer, who became a senator later, who was an extremely highly educated person, and Mr. Bill Marshall, who's still alive in St. John's, Newfoundland, who's a lawyer, retired now, and was my Minister of Energy. Mr. Ottenheimer was my Minister of Justice. They were key people in producing this document, as well as many others, and where we deliberately put in there, whilst it's extremely important to put it in the Constitution, we realized even in the Constitution, you need an educated population, right? You need a very honest, accountable government, and here they're the most unaccountable government, the federal government, and many of the provinces we've ever had since 1867, right? We need an independent judiciary, which is questionable we have today, given these court decisions so far, right? And we need the rule of law. So it's really funny. I've come full circle as a person from August 1980 to now here, June 2022, where those 4 concepts that we foreshadow are sadly coming to bear tragic fruit.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I need, even when you mentioned the independence of the judiciary, you know, two things instantly come to mind. One is specific to the Supreme Court, one specific to the independence of police, you know, but just recently there's been, you know, reporting circulating regarding comments that Chief Justice Wagner has made specific to the convoy. And it's like, how could there be an impartial jury after making those kind of comments, an impartial jury or an impartial judge, when the Chief Supreme Court Justice is attacking the Freedom Convoy? And then on the you know, you have the Emergency Act debacle committee that's taking place in the House of Commons right now, where, you know, who decided to invoke the Emergency Act? Was it the police? Well, they all say no, but no one will admit that they're putting, you know, repeatedly lying that it was the police that asked for it, and also basing it on like news stories that have been proven to be false and retracted.
Exactly.
And then of course, most recently, the most recent scandal being the allegations against Commissioner Lucky for trying to interfere with a mass homicide investigation, to pressure homicide investigators to release information on the influence of the Prime Minister's office and Minister Blair. And for me, based on my experience in the Mounties, and I know other Mounties have been vocal about this as well, or former Mounties, is I 100% believe that Superintendent Darren Campbell, an experienced homicide investigator like that, he knows anytime you're dealing with a sensitive issue, copious, detailed notes. And it's not, and a part of that is that CYA concept, right? Because you know that this could come back to bite you. So you document to make sure that you have evidence to support you're telling the truth.
Exactly.
And so I have no doubt in my mind, he's telling the truth, not even for I've I'll have to be careful. I've personally witnessed other incidents where I've seen the political influence on our senior management. I'm just not able to speak to the details of how I know that, because I'm still bound by the oath of secrecy. But one of my earlier speeches, when I was speaking out, I was quoting the mandate letter to Commissioner Lucky from then Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale, emphasizing police independence. Yes. And where has that gone?
Yes, exactly.
I think there is a growing and justified mistrust in a lot of our major institutions. And it's concerning to me that there's a growing nihilism about whether people's vote counts. And, we saw that with Ontario with low voter turnout. I guess what do you think is the answer? Like from someone who knows the political game, like, is it broken beyond repair, or can we salvage the institutions, in your opinion?
I published a Magna Carta, as I call it, the new Magna Carta for Canada. And I outlined in that the things that we could do today without even changing the Constitution at all, existing things we could do to make our country perhaps have a chance of succeeding, right?
I have it right here.
Yeah, and I have copious copies here before me. And let me just say one thing before I answer that question. Here is the I want to just put that up. Here is the actual statement where I say, when you talk about the superintendent in Nova Scotia, the chief guy who was overseeing that mass homicide, and where he kept copious notes. I was always known in my administration for producing documents. I produced document after document, and has it ever held me in good stead. While explicit constitutional reference will have a significant normative value, the ultimate guarantee of liberty rests with the vigilance of the citizen, the accountability of government, the independence of the judiciary, and the rule of law. Mm. That's right out of that document, in the same way as that person in Nova Scotia, that RCMP person overseeing that mass homicide, had kept his notes. I kept my notes, and we cannot be faulted. And like you say, the validity and credibility of that man in Nova Scotia, through your own process within the RCMP, I know through my own process in government, right, that these kinds of documents, these kinds of notes stand the test of time. Mm-hmm. And so I totally support what you just said. Now, what can we do? And this is where the rubber hits the road, Daniel, and I'm so happy to be on your program today. And I'm not going to stop talking about this. And this is where, what shall I say, the hens scatter, the chickens begin to scatter, okay? These are all friends of mine. These are people who support the freedom movement, okay? But when I've mentioned and I've made public this document, and my first point in order to bring some credibility back to our system is to have a citizen-led, well-prepared, well-funded by competent people, a citizens-led national inquiry, not a federal inquiry or provincial inquiry, but an inquiry to look at all the mandates in all the 14 governments of Canada, right? National inquiry to get at the bottom as to what's happened in the last 2 years. Was all of these mandates necessary? That's, you bring in your experts, and we have the experts. We have Paul Alexander's, Brian Bridles of this world, the Eric Paynes of this world, the Roger Hodkinsons of this world. We have the Peter McCulloughs of this world, the Pierre Corys of this world. We have people overseas, all of whom will testify at this national kind of inquiry. Well, that has not gained great traction in the country. Mm. And early on, amongst the people that I have been dealing, they were advocating a federal inquiry. In other words, the mandates of the provinces, the 10 provinces and the 3 territories, would not be covered. And I pointed out, this won't work because the people of Canada will have no credibility. And you're trying to assess one mandate and leaving the other 13 alone. That's not credible. And so that's one of the problems we have right now, is getting all of the freedom organizations in Canada to agree in principle on a citizens-led inquiry, where we will put the pressure upon all the governments of Canada to release all their data to this independent inquiry, right? To be properly set up. It will take time, no question. But in this case, in order to save the country, this is necessary. And so I have not gotten the kind of support for this idea that I should be getting, that the idea should be getting, whether it's to me or not. I don't care about that. All I'm saying is that there has to be a citizens-led national inquiry to answer those two questions. Was this really necessary? And was this what happened was constitutional? And then, by the way, and then the other part of what really scares people, I'm actually saying that if somebody in the NWT or somebody in Newfoundland or somebody in BC or somebody in the federal government is found guilty of violating, right, their responsibilities, then they must be charged and there must be accountability and people must be brought to justice. Well, now that really rattles me. They don't say anything directly to me, but their silence later tells it all, okay? Now, in the same way, Danny, I've got to say, while I'm on this, my next point is one that has gotten total and utter silence. All registered political parties must be obligated by law to publish audited financial statements annually. As we sit here today, not one political party that sits in the House of Commons produces audited financial statements publicly. So if you're to bring honesty and integrity to government, if these are the political parties that are going to run the government and manage the billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, then they should show us that they're capable of doing this by showing us how they manage the money they receive from their memberships. Otherwise, what trust can we give ourselves that this political party or that political party is going to be able to manage the billions of dollars of taxpayers' money if they won't show us how they operate and manage the millions of dollars of membership money in their political parties?
Well, I think the vast majority of Canadians, no matter which way you or where on the spectrum you fall in political views, would think that that's quite reasonable, right? I think, like,
but when they move, but when they say that, I've had this happen to me, Danny, in the last few months, okay, in the last few weeks. Had this happen to me. When I've said that to people, they say, well, yeah, I agree, but they go ahead then and support a given political party, even though what I just said, they support the status quo rather than the change that I'm advocating. And so, therefore, if we don't do those first two things, first find out just what happened in the last 2 years, because people have died. I know people in my family and extended family who've died. People who, because they weren't looked after. Because now when the mandate came down, it was all about those people with COVID. Forget about the appointments for cancer, for all kinds, for all heart disease, all kinds of stuff, where operations were necessary right away and they didn't get them and they died.
Yeah. And
people are permanently injured because they never got seen by a doctor. We've got 5 million Canadians that don't have a family physician today. And so I don't understand why more Canadians don't get it when it comes to, we need to clean up what happened in the last 2 years and find out what was valid and what was not valid before we can move on with any degree of trust in the future. And then as we move on, and if we have that Citizens National Inquiry, we must engage ourselves and support political parties who are honest and have full and absolute integrity. Because how can we then ensure that this won't happen again if we still have corrupt parties running the government?
Well, I think that inquiry is also key, because we cannot just allow everyone to be like, oh, amazing, everything's back to normal now, the new normal. And this just proves to be another, that incrementalism that just keeps encroaching and encroaching and encroaching. And so that becomes the new baseline of the expectation the next time any kind of contagion goes worldwide.
Exactly.
Yeah, because
that inquiry is absolutely crucial. And the chances of getting it today, I have to say, I'm very disappointed on where we are today as it relates to that. Hopefully, these organizations across the nation that are involved, and I won't name names, I'll stay away from it, but we all know who they are. There's quite a few freedom groups around, but they need to all come together. This is a national issue. This is not a federal issue or a provincial issue. This is not a political issue. This is an issue for the nation. As citizens of the nation, we've got to repair our system. Yes. And one way to start repairing it and give us some hope is to investigate those last 2 years where so much damage has been done. I keep referring to Dr. Douglas Allen of Simon Fraser University, right? I mean, he produced a report in April 2021 after looking at 80 studies from around the world, which showed that the cure was worse than the disease.
Absolutely.
And he actually said in that report that 90 days after the pandemic was declared, there was data coming out to show clearly. So even 90 to 100 days after the pandemic in 2020, there was a lot of indications. And there were people out there, by the way, advocating about vitamin D, right, and early treatments, very, very early on. All of this was ignored. So the legitimacy of a national inquiry is beyond reproach. The legitimacy of a national inquiry is beyond reproach when we look at how many people have died, how many people were injured in our own extended families or friendships, we know. And we know within our own provinces and our own communities. So the legitimacy of this is beyond reproach in my view.
Well, and when you follow all of the different experts that you had mentioned earlier, and these big groups, right, like the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, their partner, their sister organization in the United States, the FLCCC, globalcovidsummit.org, the Great Barrington Declaration authors, right? Like, I was sitting in a meeting just the other day with Paul Alexander, who I know you're familiar with him, and he has a very extensive resume of his experience. A leading expert in evidence-based medicine. And he said him and his colleagues have looked at every piece of evidence about the lockdowns, nothing to prove that they were effective or that they were.
Exactly.
Masking, same thing. Mass vaccination, same thing. In fact, it has made the problem worse and prolonged the situation, right? Everything that we did was the opposite of what was being recommended and what was currently or was previously known to be best practice in the management of something such as COVID. And I know that you're familiar with David Redman as well. I've read some of his documents.
I was just going to mention them. It's fantastic.
Yeah, his keynote paper, Canada's Deadly Response to COVID-19, was kind of what put me on to investigating for myself into these different pandemic response plans. So I looked at Ontario's, I looked at the federal plan, and they were all consistent, right? It was a Great Barrington Declaration approach, focus protection. So, lockdowns were only meant as an absolute last resort for something far more fatal. Masking was never mentioned unless it was a fit tested N95 for healthcare, treating an infected patient. Early treatment was 100% part of the plan. It says it right in both of them. And and doctors in this country and around the world were vilified and disciplined and intimidated and threatened under loss of license for just trying to develop treatment protocols for people. Yeah.
But I remember as premier of the Emergency Measures Organization and how they came in all the provinces, right? And they were there to do exactly what they were supposed to do. And yet the governments all ignored their EMOs, their Emergency Measures Organizations in all their jurisdictions. They ignored them completely. And yet here people sitting there ready to jump into action at a moment's notice, who were doing the very thing that the pandemic results were showing. And so, you know, and then you look at a Dr. Hoff, right? You look at Dr. Charles Hoff in British Columbia and how he was treated, right? And others, and the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons, the British Columbia College of Physicians are issuing statements threatening these doctors, and how Dr. Hoff lost over half his income because he was refused his privileges at the hospital in Kamloops, right? I mean, the way he was treated, the way he was vilified by the press, by his own, you know, medical organization, College of Physicians. Sure, this is what I don't understand about Canadians or people around the world, for that matter, where mandates like ours have been brought in, and Australia and New Zealand. I just don't understand, and that's why I think you and I and others are attracted to things like mass psychosis. There must be something else at play here, which is triggering people that you knew, both in your family and your friends, who seem to be rational, reasonable people, who suddenly have bought into this mass psychosis thing, which completely ignores reality.
Evidence.
Charles Hoff, Exhibit A. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I've caught myself saying lately, like, I don't know if evidence matters anymore.
Exactly.
Right? Like, if the evidence goes against the powers that be, they can just brush it off and make statements like, well, I interpret that differently. And for some reason, you know, as soon as the next distraction comes along, people forget about it and it fades away.
Objective reality is no longer a valid concept in the world. It's scary and dangerous, the pathway that we're continuing to go on as a society, and it will surely lead to the fall of democracy in the Western world. There is absolutely no question, if it hasn't already done so. I mean, because for people to still be silent about Dr. Charles Hoff or about the College of Physicians and Surgeons, about this wonderful evidence that Alexander and Bridle and others have presented, to completely ignore that from the establishment all the way down to the body politic, surely is indicative of a society that is no longer democratic and responsive.
Well, I roller coaster almost on a daily basis. Some days I'm feeling optimistic, and then even within that same day, I can be down here and just like, oh, what is going on? And I know I've thought to myself so many times, like, is it beyond the point of no return? Can we still right the ship? Right? Like, because it seems like we are on that incremental trajectory toward a totalitarian type, authoritarian type government. And it just seems to be everything that happens, like even the Tamara Leach arrest, like we discussed earlier, is just another example of the provocation. And it's like, we're just going to keep taking and see what you do. And then we're going to take a little bit more and see what you do. And my fear is that the discontent that is building in this country and the continued pressure that is being applied, at some point in time, we're going to reach a break point. And I'm really concerned about what that's going to look like. And I know I don't want to give up on Canada, but I also have a young family that I need to take care of. And I know I'm already at a point where I'm selling my home in Ontario because I don't feel welcome here anymore. Right. And I'm taking my family back to Alberta because I will feel that they're safe there. Right. Like, I never thought I would ever feel that way in my own country. Like, we're uprooting our children from their home and from their friends because I feel that they will be safer in rural Alberta with our families. So where my dad and my wife's dad, they know how to survive, right? And if things go for I call it a total dumpster fire, and we go off the rails, that my family will be okay. If that's our best chance at weathering this incoming storm.
And I have friends in the surrounding area here who are making similar plans, and because we're in a more rural area, they're even more rural than I am. I'm in a small city of 14,000 people, and they're in a rural section which is outside the municipality, and they have property and land, and therefore they can homeschool or and grow. And they have a network, by the way. The network's already established, has been established for a couple of years, and they can share food, and they can share education, and they can get along just fine. Thank you very much. Yeah. And then I have other people who have gone an extra step. I was in an interview with a person the other day from Alberta who's actually leaving Alberta and going to Mexico. Yeah. Sold her house and gone. And I know other people. Talking to a lady 2 weeks ago who was down in Nicaragua. We know quite a few people who've moved to Nicaragua, for example. Others have moved to Costa Rica, and so on. And so there's a lot of movement by Canadians who can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. Well, it's heartbreaking. It is. I know. Our family knows of at least 5 families in this geographic area, all similar mindset as us, and all like relatively same age group, kids, all liquidating, moving to Costa Rica. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's and like I say, when you see, I think mentioning the Chief Justice was very appropriate because it's been on my mind every day to see the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada make these statements. And he is our chief law officer, and he's already made up his mind, and he's going to have cases come before him, appeal to his court. Well, obviously, I hope he's going to recuse himself because he cannot hear a case now relating to the charter because he is already, before the evidence is in and brought before him, made up his mind. But it does speak to, I mean, how can, when somebody comes to me now, and I'll be doing interviews, and I'll be doing live public meetings with citizens, and they say to me, Brian, did you hear the Chief Justice comments? Yes, I had. As a citizen of Canada, should I have any confidence in the judiciary? What can be my answer? What can be my answer? And I had the decisions of Manitoba, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan before me from their courts, where they have ignored different parts of the charter in order to selectively make a decision in favor of the government. So it's pretty hard, and they're looking to me to give them an answer. Yeah, and they say the word hope. Give me some hope. People come to me with those same, not the same level of expertise as you, but it's like people look to me as if I'm some kind of authority on the law as well. And I'm like, I know like some basics regarding criminal law. Like my career was pretty basic. But people are so starved for some encouragement and some hope, right? They're just barely hanging on. And I don't know if we will ever fully understand the scope of the damage that has been done over the last 2 years, like the medical problems, the physical, mental health problems, education setbacks, business setbacks, economic losses, and the divide relationships destroyed between friends and family. Like I have people that won't even look at me anymore. They think I'm a criminal. And back in August of last year, we were totally fine to hang out with each other. It's it's very, very disappointing and very, very tragic, as you and I go about every day trying to fight this thing and have, like you say, family and friends who think that we're really, really we're really lost our minds. And then to have a Chief Justice and to have a former senator and all these people come out almost daily now, indicating that somehow, and then for the Prime Minister of Canada to call you and me a racist, to call us a misogynist, that perhaps we're taking up some space that should be taken up by other more decent people. I mean, that's in my affidavit before the courts, the Prime Minister's own statements. How can you have faith in a country when a Prime Minister and a Chief Justice are out there already labeling people without any due process, have already found you guilty?
Well, it comes back to that same issue of making like these harmful, vague statements without any individual evidence to prove what you're saying.
Yep.
Like to back up.
As you say, the police never recommended the Emergencies Act, right?
No.
And now you've got the Emergencies Act being re-examined by who? Some of the very people who supported the Emergencies Act coming in, the same Parliament. I mean, this is the other problem you've got. This is why a national citizens inquiry is so important. You can't have the people who committed the alleged incident be the ones to judge whether they did or not.
I have a couple of questions specific to that you just brought to mind. Even it appears to me that even some of the NDP members of that committee are growing frustrated with let's call it the non-answers provided by Minister Mendicino and Freeland, Blair. Your experience in government, I'm always surprised, during question period or during these exchanges, why does the speaker allow people to not answer questions? Like, I would think that would be something that would be kind of a foundational responsibility of the Speaker of the House to call it out. Like, if you're avoiding a question or providing an answer to a question, why doesn't the Speaker stop and say, no, please answer the question?
Yeah. The Speaker's power goes so far. I had to look up Beauchesne and May, the two experts that everybody looks at. But there's where the Parliament has really broken down. It's because, like in my day, I could never tell an MLA, even on my side of the House, what to say, or the minister what to say. And when I went to the House of Commons, after I published my book in 2012, I was in Ottawa doing interviews about my book, and I went to the House of Commons, and I was even startled at the degree. And Harper was Prime Minister at the time, and he was somebody who I had supported. And I sat in the gallery and I watched these ministers and parliamentary secretaries to the ministers issue generic statements that had been prepared ahead of time in anticipation of the question. That was never done in my day. And I was absolutely astounded to see the degree to which it had taken over the House of Commons. So all of these questions are all anticipated, and then a standard answer given. In the same way as now, if you write an MP for the NDP or the Liberals about the mandates, you get back this generic reply that everybody gets the same. The
carbon copy.
That was never done in my day. So there's been a deterioration in the integrity of Parliament. The other thing that has been done is that a lot of the MPs don't even know the rules of the Parliament. They have not studied the rules of the House so that they can stand up on a point of order or a point of privilege and point out to the Speaker, Your Honour, the Honourable Minister for External Affairs, in an answer to my question, by Beauchesne, by May, has not answered my question. And I once again must, Your Honour, through you, ask the Minister to please stand in his place and answer the question. And you can make them more embarrassed, the government more embarrassed, if you have people on the other side of the House who are well versed in parliamentary procedure, both on privilege and on point of order and point of privilege, where you can bring the government ministers in great disrepute over a very short period of time. That's one of the problems we have. MPs don't look. I've done briefings to MPs and MLAs across the country, and none of them knew the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. None of them had read it. Somebody else told them about this section, or they saw something in the news or something in the newspaper. They themselves have not sat down and read it. And the other area where our system really is falling down, besides like this, and then now if the MP did that in the House of Commons, the Speaker would be forced to say to the Minister, please answer the question that was, give an answer to the question that was asked, right? And then you can really help make the government feel more uncomfortable, right? And so that these standard answers become exposed a lot more than they are today. I was surprised how these were not exposed when I was sitting in the House of Commons in 2012 in the gallery. And so there are measures, if our system was working properly and the MPs were doing their job, which could make it far more difficult for the government to operate the way they're operating now.
Okay, so it sounds like, so there is a mechanism by which they can
Yes.
pressure the speaker to get an answer.
Yes.
Okay, but they're probably
Definitely.
just unfamiliar with it.
And but in other words, they should be fired because they're not carrying out their job as an MP. Their job description includes that kind of stuff. And so, you know, this is the sad part of our democracy has been so denigrated and so undermined by the majority party, like in the parliamentary committees. One of the other things I say in my Magna Carta is that no parliamentary committee can be closed down by the majority when there is evidence still available that they have refused to hear. For example, Judy Wilson-Raybould,
Yes.
former minister in Trudeau's cabinet, had more information she wanted to present to the parliamentary committee. The parliamentary committee closed down. She was unable, former attorney general, former minister of the Crown, was unable to present all of the information she had available to give to the committee. The committee closed her down. That is a sign of a democracy that is in not only in decline, no longer exists in that particular area.
Yeah, I remember expecting that was going to be the end of the government, was the SNC Lavalin, Jody Wilson-Raybould affair. And when that just kind of fizzled away, I was in disbelief, like a clear obstruction of the Attorney General.
Right.
The Attorney and Minister of Justice. But I wish the Commissioner had the courage and integrity that Jody Wilson-Raybould exhibited.
Right.
So I get building off that. I know that we did cover in your background that you had served some time within the Privy Council, correct?
I am a Privy Councillor. Okay.
So, and I've heard you talk about that's centralization of power from the MPs towards the Privy Council and the PMO. I don't think a lot of people are very well versed in the difference between them and what their functions, they are. Now, for me, my basic understanding is the PMO is specific to the Prime Minister's office, whereas the Privy Council is kind of like a bureaucratic continuity of.
It's supposed to report to the cabinet.
Oh, okay.
Clerk of Executive Council or clerk of Privy, right? That's what it's supposed to be, right? The Privy Council words have become sort of meaningless in the last 20 or 30 years, okay? And the Privy Council has really now become an extension of the Prime Minister's office. Mm-hmm. And that's how they've been able to sort of get away with it. So how many people work for the Prime Minister's office? And they'll give you the answer that it's just the Prime Minister's office, 400 or 500. They don't mention the 1,000 that work for the Privy Council office who also report to the Prime Minister. Okay, so the Privy Council office is supposed to be a policy support agency of the cabinet. But because the cabinet has become secondary to the power moving to the Prime Minister's office without the shot being fired, okay, that Privy Council office reports, because the clerk of the Executive Council or the clerk of cabinet reports to the Prime Minister. Okay, and where does Privy Council report? To the clerk, who reports to the Prime Minister. So what you have essentially then is both the Privy Council office, which was supposed to be a support mechanism for the cabinet, now being a support mechanism for just one member of that cabinet, the Prime Minister.
Well, and I think
that's what's happened. So now we have 1,500 or 1,600 people working directly daily, reporting to the Prime Minister, plus the 7,000 deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers who also were appointed by the Prime Minister. And so why the Prime Minister needs 1,500 or 1,600 when he's already got 7,000 that he appoints in any case shows you the level to which the power has been concentrated in the Prime Minister's office. So we have a de facto president now.
Yeah.
And in all the provinces, we have a de facto president. Not just in the Prime Minister's office or in Ottawa, in all the provincial capitals, the premiers are acting the same way as the Prime Minister. And so it's being, so the premier and the Prime Minister has become more powerful without a shot being fired, a law being changed. And so that therefore everybody just naturally bows to what did the Prime Minister's office say. So you go into a cabinet meeting now, a cabinet committee meeting is only as good, and quite likely that cabinet committee meeting is chaired by who? Takes minutes, either the clerk of the full cabinet or one of his aides, right? Assistant clerk, okay? Who do they report to? Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And so when you get into a cabinet committee meeting, the first thing the ministers will say, well, what does the Prime Minister say? What does the Premier say? What is the position of the Premier or the Prime Minister on this? And so very little dissent is now permitted. Years ago, in my day, a lot of dissent was permitted. And the caucus really worked. The caucus was a place for individual MPs and MLAs in every party, right, to get together weekly and have a huge debate about what was coming up in the House of Commons, what piece of legislation or the many pieces of legislation. And very often in my caucus, there was huge disagreements. I remember when the seatbelt legislation came up in Newfoundland and I was premier. I had two very, very libertarian conservative MLAs who would not go along with that. You're interfering with the rights of individuals. And they abstained, or they could have voted against it if they had wanted to. Okay, that was allowed. That was allowed. And that was a huge debate in all of the caucuses. Now, the other thing is, any great piece of legislation years ago of any consequence would go to the caucus first before it went to the House of Commons. Okay, so the government's caucus would meet and they'd fight over this legislation. I remember giving a presentation to people in the Northwest Territories. And one of the people who were in on the call was a local MLA, local member for the territorial government, okay? And was an MLA on the government side of the House in Yellowknife. And this person spoke up and said, you know, I really appreciate what you've just told me about the process of government and the institutions. So what can I do? And I asked her this question: do you have caucus meetings? She said, well, every now and then. Well, I said, you can immediately, with your other caucus members, insist upon having the government caucus meet and discuss every piece of new legislation that your government is going to bring in, and that it's got to go through the caucus first, right? So you get, and she, oh my. She said, we don't do that. Well, I said, go do it. That's something you can do tomorrow.
Yeah.
You can insist to your leader, to your premier, whatever you want to call him in the territories, you can insist to your leader, all legislation that comes through you and the cabinet that you want to present to the legislature must go through your government caucus first. And she said, that's a wonderful idea. And I said that to MLAs in Alberta. Make sure your caucus is operating like it's supposed to. Everything must go through your caucus first. The leader and the cabinet can't bring in things which have not gone through the caucus. Insist upon it. And by the way, if you insisted upon it, the government would suddenly realize they don't have a majority to pass that piece of legislation unless they got these members on side. In most governments in Canada today, if the government caucus says, I want to see that first, the ministers and the premier got to abide by that, because they know without those MLAs, they won't have support to pass that piece of legislation.
So is that true in the federal House, in the federal
Yes.
caucus as well? Because
yes.
I think that's a question a lot of people have, and I mean, way outside my expertise, is like, how come so many have been so silent for so long, right? Even within the official opposition up until recently. Like,
exactly.
why, like,
the question is, how much is now through the Liberal Party of Canada going through the caucus as it relates to measures that are coming into the House of Commons? Do they all go to the government caucus first? How much time is given for it? More. Same way in the NDP caucus. Because the NDP party and the Liberal Party now create the government of Canada, the question has to be asked, does every single piece of legislation that's being proposed by the government go through your caucuses to be vented first? Yes or no?
Well, so when you said like in during your time, there was open for debate and you could vote it sounds like you could vote your conscience, right?
Yes.
Even if you didn't,
yes.
But, I guess my basic understanding is that currently, if you go against the grain, the whip is going to come and discipline you in some way.
Exactly.
Right?
The other thing we used to do, because very often the MLA who's not in the cabinet hasn't got a full grounding of the piece of legislation, right? Like a cabinet minister does, because it was developed in a certain department, brought up through the cabinet process to a cabinet committee, then to the full cabinet. So all the cabinet ministers were well versed in that piece of legislation. The MLA, the backbencher, was not. The backbencher was not. So what we would do with any piece of legislation that came in the caucus, we would bring in the minister responsible for that legislation, make sure he was going to be present in caucus, plus the deputy minister, plus the other people who were responsible for helping to draft it. And then let the MLAs ask questions. So before they opposed it, or thought they opposed it, they understood what this legislation was all about. Then, after understanding it, then they could take their positions.
So, what do you think the driving force is behind that centralization of power away from the individual MPs? But like, what's the mechanism that has occurred? How have members of parliament or members of provincial parliament allowed that power shift to occur?
Incrementalism over time.
Okay,
it's
just
incrementalism over time. Yeah. And then the justification, we'll only do it this time, right? Or we'll only do it this time, then it gets done another time. Well, we did that last year. Oh, but you told us it was for the last time. But this is like that one. This piece of legislation is so important. We've got to move it through fast before the House closes for the summer, or some other kind of reason that they give. And suddenly it becomes a pattern. The pattern the behavior pattern sort of develops, right? And then they get more and more people. For example, see, the Prime Minister has all these people who are parliamentary secretaries. Well, they're getting money, extra money. So they're going to be out with their pals right down at the bar in Ottawa in the nighttime and say, you got to go along with this, right? You got to go along. This is what this really means, right? You're my buddy. You got to go along with this. So the Prime Minister has a lot of levers at his disposal, just not ministers. He's got a lot of these parliamentary secretaries, and they're beholden to the Prime Minister for this extra $50,000 or $60,000 a year. They got a small family. They had to move to Ottawa. They had to move somewhere else. They need this extra money. And so they will go out of their way to advance what they know is an improper procedure for getting this stuff approved. So they'll go along because they need the money.
So financial incentive.
Very insidious kind of thing. I used to say years ago to Jeffrey Simpson and some other national columnists who were around at the time, you guys are perpetrating the wink and the nod. In the United States, it usually has to be a congressional hearing. Here it is like a caucus meeting, right? A parliamentary committee that can be closed down at any time, and it's a wink and a nod. They try not to put it in writing if they can help it, but they'll take you out to dinner, they'll do this, they'll do that. And over time, this is what has happened. The degradation of our system of accountability has happened by stealth and by time and by people who love power and want to expedite things to advance their particular agenda.
Okay, so it seems like that same pattern that we've, you could apply that to multiple institutions, but just to summarize, it sounds like there's financial incentive for the people who are going to impart the constant manipulation, to create that like peer pressure mentality.
Right.
And almost on the basis of like, it's a constant state of, I won't say panic, but like, we need to get this done right away. Like there's this false sense of urgency, right?
And then if you've got an ambitious MP who didn't make it to the cabinet or make it to the parliamentary secretary in the first go around after the election, but is very ambitious, they're going to keep their powder dry so that because they are bright, they're smart, they know they're bright, they know they're smart, they know how come I got missed? Okay. And then the parliamentary secretary or some minister will take them on the side and say, well, do you just keep quiet and you support what's going on, and you'll have a really good shot at being a parliamentary secretary within a year. But if you start getting in caucus and start kicking up a racket, right, and wanting a certain procedure done and reporting done, then your chances of being on the good side of the minister or the prime minister or the prime minister's office, who will help the prime minister decide who should be in the cabinet next time, because there's people, the chief of staff and others in the prime minister's office, who help the prime minister decide who their ministers are. So the prime minister will say to his chief of staff and so on, how did they behave over the last 3 or 4 months, right? In our caucus meetings, how, were they that pissed off that they never got in the cabinet or never got, because they're bright people or whatever, and I was looking at this person that perhaps might be a good parliamentary secretary next time. Well, Prime Minister, he or she has been pretty damn difficult. Okay, we'll leave it for, we'll go to somebody else then, right? And that's how the system in Canada works today.
So like grooming and rewarding compliance.
Exactly.
Oh, that sounds just like the RCMP.
And exactly.
And that's why the RCMP as an organization is in a leadership crisis as well, and has been for, well, probably since as long as I was involved anyway.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wow, I'm learning a lot about intergovernmental policy.
And the other thing is that MLAs don't understand is you can get a lot of changes if you're smart and if you know your subject matter. I can remember of pieces of legislation that came before our caucus, before I became a parliamentary secretary and before I became premier, that I was able to influence and change before it ever came to the House. Okay. And the other thing is, these parliamentary committees that examine the budget, right? We don't necessarily need a parliamentary budget officer, but we've been forced into it because the parliament itself is not doing its job. The Public Accounts Committee and the other ones that are supposed to oversee the budget are not doing their job. We don't need to add another big bureaucracy. We need the MLAs and the MPs to be having the minister and his officials come into the parliamentary committee in public hearing, asking questions about this and that provision in your budget of the department of this department, and so on. And so if that was done on a regular basis, the MPs would have a lot of work to do. It would be very, very busy, and the government would have to be far more responsible.
So that I really like the direction you're going there, because I'm sure you get this as well. You just get bombarded with people coming up with novel approaches to try and tackle this problem, and some of them might have some credence, but a lot of them I'm just like, the general population will not support that.
But in the system as it is, you can do change.
Exactly. So the system has become corrupted, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need the individuals in the system to behave with courage and integrity and honesty.
Exactly. That's why the Magna Carta, everything in there, is something you can do tomorrow.
Yeah, I love it. It's a practical application that could be appealing to the population as a whole, not just the 15, 20% that are in our mindset.
The wheel. We don't need to. If our system, right, was working, it's like today, the health department. Health is completely provincial. You look it up in the BNA Act, health and education are the exclusive jurisdiction of the province. Okay, that's what it says. Not just the jurisdiction of the province, the exclusive jurisdiction of the province. Meanwhile, what has corrupted our system? The Canada Health Act came in, which all provinces agreed to. In that Canada Health Act, the government of Canada is going to transfer to the provinces, right? Establish program financing, the Canada Health Transfer, the Canada Social Transfer, and so on. Separate from equalization, by the way, separate from equalization, these two transfers to go to the wealthy provinces as well as the poorer provinces, okay? Now we're in a situation, the pandemic happens. Here's a really good example. This is a today example. Pandemic happens. And Quebec or Saskatchewan says, their Minister of Health says to the Premier to have a meeting and say, my officials are saying we got to bring in these mandates and we got to do this. And Premier Moe says, or Premier Kennedy says at the time, well, I don't like that. We're going to have to go through caucus and cabinet with this. We're going to have to take a harder look at this. The Public Health Agency of Canada, I've been talking to, my deputy minister has been talking to Dr. Tam and talking to the others in public health, and they've got this data that they think really shows that we've got to do something quickly here, and we mightn't have time to go, and so. I just don't know. And then all of a sudden, the Minister of Health or the Deputy Minister, who's in on this meeting, this happens every day, all over Canada. Well, Premier, Prime Minister, well, not Prime Minister in this case, just this will be the premiers. Well, premiers, Premier, how much we're getting in Canada social transfer this year? How much we? Well, we're getting, proportion. We're getting $1 billion. It's 40 billion, by the way, last year, over 40 billion going to the premiers, going to the province, and we're in a deficit. So this will increase our deficit by another $500 million to 3 billion, 4 billion, depending on what province it is. Oh my God! And they've indicated to us, that you got to go along with this. We don't want to. We would not like to go ahead and re-examine the Canada health transfer, would we?
Beholden financially to the Prime Minister's office.
So the original concept of confederation has been undermined by all of these new measures that have come in, that have where we've watched the federal incursion into provincial jurisdiction with the provinces going along with it, making it impossible later on when a crisis, alleged crisis comes up, for them to stand their ground as having provincial jurisdiction and saying, no, we can't do this, or we can't do this at this time, or whatever. And so the confederation becomes blurred. And then you talk about asymmetrical federalism, right? It's no longer symmetrical in the sense of what the BNA Act said, and here are the powers here, here are the powers here, here's where we share, blah, blah, blah. It has become blurred. And so custom and convention now takes precedence over the principles that are in the Constitution, beholden to the federal government because we're so poor. We're also getting equalization, and we're getting all of this health money and this social transfer money. We cannot afford to say no, even though we have the power under the Constitution to say no.
Listening to all of this and your explanation regarding the health, the transfer payments for the Health Act, under the Health Act, and also equalization, and considering what just happened in Alberta with the leadership review and the resignation of Premier Kenney, I wonder if Alberta would be the most likely jurisdiction where a citizen's inquiry would be supported.
Saskatchewan, Alberta.
Yeah.
Would be quite likely the place where it would be. No question about that. Notwithstanding the fact that they've, capitulated on a lot of these areas of provincial, and there's no question. Listen, the reason why I can talk so fervently about this, okay, you must understand, and Canadians must understand, I went through this personally. I went through this personally. I fought the federal government and said, I am not going to bow, even though you're going to take money away from me, and I was a have-not province. I'm not going to bow. My caucus would come to me, my cabinet would come to me, I'd get letters. I'd be in public meetings where people say, but Premier, if you do that, that negotiation that you're having on the other side. I had people come to me threatening me that if you stand for the offshore rights, the chances the federal government helping you on Churchill Falls debacle will not be there. And I would go back to these people and say, I can't tell you their names. Some of them were political, some of them were corporate, friends of, who came to the back door and threatened me. And I would say, that's to do with the offshore, that's to do with water. They're separate legislations, separate things. And if you try to bring them together, I'm going to have a press conference and say I'm being threatened. None of the premiers do that today.
That reminds me of my last conversation I had with a supervisor of mine before I left the office. He asked me, he said, "What do you think you're going to do? Take on the federal government?" And I mean, certainly not alone, but we kind of have to a degree.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we're still working at it. We're still working at it.
Absolutely. And people said to me afterwards, "How could you get that agreement?" Because they were threatening you. I said, I took them on. Because if I went out with a press conference and I just had a phone call from an emissary from the federal government who are threatening me in water power because I took a position on the fishery or on a position on offshore, I could blow them out of the water. And I had enough credibility that people would more likely believe me than believe the other side if they tried to defend themselves. That's how I won the Atlantic Accord. Because constitutionally, the court had turned me down. And I got through the back door when I couldn't get through the front door, almost the same kinds of provisions. Yeah. It's a complete anomaly. I fought the federal government and won.
You know, I think one of the best interviews I've listened to in the last 6 months was you and Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot listening to that. And I remember listening to him and some of his advice, because I've been a big follower of his teachings on how to be a better version of yourself. And I remember him saying, like, you want an adventure, tell the truth and you'll see an adventure. And I know, and like, not to participate in the lie. And I know when people come up to me and, you know, "Oh, thank you for taking a stand. Thank you for speaking up for us."
Exactly.
I say, like, I didn't do anything special. I just said what I believe to be true. And that's what I keep doing. Right. And I refuse to bow to the lie. I know they're lying. I know it's harming people. And as a police officer, it was my duty to do something about it. And so I told the truth. That's how I feel about it anyway.
I had three things that I used to do to high school graduations and school graduations I'd be invited to after I was elected to the legislature, after I was a minister, and even after I was premier. So I would go to as many as I could. And especially to a high school graduation, they would ask me, you know, what are your, okay, you were a teacher here at this school or in this community or in this riding or in this province, and now you went to be a minister and so on. And what lessons, what advice would you give? And I've been consistent since 1972 to today. Three things: be honest, be a tiny bit brazen, and be yourself.
Yes. Well, when I was trying to decide what course of action I was going to take, I was trying to justify going along with the mandate. Even so far as to say, you know what, I'll probably be okay, and then I can fight this from the inside. I was trying all kinds of sneaky things to try and convince myself to just do it. And because under this false illusion that would make my problems go away and I would be all right. But I knew, and it just kept coming up over and over again. I knew that if I submitted, it would destroy me psychologically, and I would feel like a coward, and I would hate myself for doing it. And and then that would just turn me toxic against my friends, against my family, against my coworkers. And I just couldn't do it. I just knew that it's a complete falsehood. And if I go along with it, I'm being a coward.
I understand it completely, because I had those same thoughts many times when I was elected to the legislature, many times, where you had to ask yourself, and then you just had to stand up and be counted. And if that meant Prime Minister, the Premier of the day had a tentative deal with René Lévesque for being able to develop more power in Labrador. And I was the Minister of Energy at the time, and I was not aware of it. And it was going to be announced the next day. I think the cabinet, and he thought that they could exclude me and I would still stay part of cabinet. I found out about it in the evening, went up to the Premier's office, kicked up one hell of a stink, finally got to see the Premier and told him, "You did not tell me about that. I'm the minister of the department for which you are now about to make an agreement, right, without including me. That is by definition wrong as it relates to process, as it relates to this, how governments operate in Canada, number one. Number two, let me see what you tentatively agreed to. What are the principles? And he showed it to me, and I said, I will hold a press conference tomorrow morning, right after yours with Mr. Levesque, and denounce this. This is not in the best interest of Newfoundland. So, and I will resign. So that's what you want to do? Go right ahead. Be my guest. That was all canceled.
Well, you drew a line in the sand that you weren't going to cross, and you weren't going to let them cross on you.
No.
Yeah. So I know we had scheduled an hour and a half. If I just have a few key questions that I'd just like to power through, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I'll make them very brief. So regarding some of the constitutional myths I've heard you speak about, one thing that always comes up, or not often comes up with me, is this idea that the charter was never ratified, or the Constitution was never ratified. We're not our own country. Just
I don't know where
put that to bed.
Yeah, well, there's a there was it was proclaimed, right, in 1982, passed by the proclaimed by the Queen, and then ratified by the Parliament. Ratified by the Parliament first, the latter part of March, and then on April 17th, it was proclaimed by the Queen, who was then the head of state for Canada and the UK. And so therefore, it is the law of Canada. It has been used by courts and by governments all over Canada ever since. So why would it be used by governments and courts all over Canada ever since if it wasn't ratified?
Well, a lot of people are under the, well, a number of people that I've spoken to, they're very attracted to the common law ideology. And when people come to me, I say, like, I'm not an expert on this, but I know common law exists. It's a real thing. From my recall in my police training, common law was where my powers of arrest originated from. So could you give like a quick, just a quick explanation of like the difference between common law and,
Common law is still operative. Lawyers can still use common law in any court action that they take on behalf of their client. If there's no other piece of legislation that deals with this matter that has been passed by a parliament.
Okay.
In our case, so in the case of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the lawyer, because it's now in the Constitution of Canada, would use the first instance, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but they could also supplement that with any common law precedents over the years since 1867, where courts have decided based upon common law in favor of their client. Okay? So both are still operative, but one takes precedence over the other because it has been passed by the Parliament of the country.
Right.
So it's not one doesn't exclude the other, one complements the other. But the Charter, because it is written and passed by the Parliament of Canada duly, right, properly, it becomes the preeminent document that one would use in defending people's rights and freedoms. But if there is other precedents based upon common law before the Constitution came in that would also buttress the case, they can still use it. It didn't eliminate common law. It just replaced certain parts of common law, like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So both are still operative. So anybody who says, well, the Charter is not there, common law is there, both are still there. But the Charter, because it is written and passed by the, but if you remember, back in 1981, when the 8 provinces challenged Pierre Elliott Trudeau to his version of patriation, to his version of the Charter, after we began negotiations, he broke off from us and went to the Parliament of Canada, passed his own patriation bill and his own Charter of Rights. We challenged him and went to the Supreme Court of Canada. What did the Supreme Court of Canada say? Like common law, custom and convention of this country since 1867 shows that this is unconstitutional because you didn't consult and get the approval of the majority of the provinces. Therefore, it's unconstitutional. It wasn't something that was written. It was something that was unwritten, like common law, like custom, like convention. So there's a really good example of having both. In 1981, it was based upon the unwritten Constitution. The Charter that was brought in as a result of Patriot Act replaces or complements any common law decisions that were made that protected the individual, but gives more strength to it because it's in the written Constitution.
Understood. Because
is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. And
now the other point, Danny, that I want to make that people raise with you and me is that the Parliament of Canada, the Parliament of England, and the monarchy still has some power.
Yes.
To they still have power over this. Well, Schedule A of the Constitution Act, which was passed, no act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed after the Constitution Act 1982 comes into force shall extend to Canada as part of its law. Yeah,
and so that's, I think
that eliminates any more. So that the whole reason for patriation was to bring the Constitution home. That's what patriation means. And so this was the final complete act of sovereignty by Canada. Before 1981, there was still some sovereignty residing in the UK.
In the UK,
after none.
Yeah, because I've had discussions with people where they talk about how Canada is not a sovereign nation. It's kind of, we've all been misled to believe that it is, but it's not, and therefore that's why they want to revert back to British common law, essentially.
Yes.
And
but here you go, section Schedule A, right? Section 2. And when I've gone back to people in email and actually copied and pasted this and showed them, right, factually showed them, here's where it is. Here's where it is. I haven't heard from them since.
Yeah.
And that's been like quite likely hundreds.
Yeah. And I think that's a symptom of people looking for a novel approach to tackle this because they're so defeated and nihilistic about our current existing system.
Yes, and the other problem is with that is that I go back to them and they really have a problem with this one. You're the one who's been attacking the British system and us being part of the British system for all this time. Now you're looking at the British system to bail us
out. Yeah, the irony is not lost for sure. Okay, I guess one of my last questions. We've covered a lot and it's been amazing. Thank you so much. With the overall dissatisfaction that I think even the silent majority of Canada are feeling about the direction of our nation and our current government, beyond, I guess, is there anything within the Constitution Act? I mean, I'm familiar with the Charter because I really had to learn a lot of that in regards to policing, but anything within the Constitution Act that lays out a process for, the Prime Minister to be replaced, or would that have to be initiated through a non-confidence election or a leadership review of his own party?
Absolutely. It has to be either through the Parliament, through a non-confidence motion, right? Where the majority and they have no more confidence in the government and bring it down for a new election to be called, or the party itself changes its leader. Or at some point, somebody lays a charge in the courts against the Prime Minister for committing some crime.
Okay.
Here's one of the problems we have in our country today, which shows how far we've fallen. This is another one of my points.
Magna Carta points?
Of the Magna Carta points is that no MP should be allowed to serve. So we can solve this tomorrow. One of the leadership, or a number of the leadership people for the Conservative Party of Canada went into the House within a couple of days to propose a motion as related to mandates and stuff. Did it in no time. Well, any MP tomorrow, and they could have a press conference right after to really put pressure on, could propose the following. The present conflict of interest legislation that is already the law of Canada is to be amended to include no member of this House of Commons, of this Parliament, can sit as an MP if they have broken the law as determined by a court of this country or by the Ethics and Conflict Commissioner that is established under this Act. So the Prime Minister of Canada today has broken the law 5 times. He's broken the conflict of interest law 5 times. The only penalty in that act today is a fine of $200 or $300.
Yeah.
I think Morneau had to pay $900, $800 for breaking the law.
Mm-hmm.
All he had to pay, could still be an MP. So in one fell swoop, we could clean up the Parliament of Canada so that nobody can serve as an MP if they have broken a law in this country. That is not in place today.
Well, and depending on what happens as a result of this public inquiry regarding the Emergencies Act and the latest scandal regarding the political interference into the mass homicide investigation in Nova Scotia, you know, those could easily be another 2 major violations for this current government.
Absolutely, but we've got to make MPs accountable, and they're not accountable now. They can break the law and sit in the Parliament to make law. Imagine a person who makes laws can break the law.
It's the world is upside down.
And then you submit to me that this is a democracy the way it was supposed to be since 1867? No, it is not. So until and unless political parties produce annual budget, right, audited financial statements, until the political parties agree that no MP can serve if they've broken the law of Canada, can serve in the Parliament, we will not get close to repairing where our problems are today.
Yeah, agreed. So my final closing question was going to be advice for people on actions that can be taken. But I think it is all outlined in your Magna Carta document, right? And I have a copy of it.
Just go to my blog, peckford42.wordpress.com.
Yep.
Or Google in Peckford 42 Magna Carta, and it'll come right up on Google.
Yeah.
Come right up on Google. You don't even have to go to my and then send that to your MP and to your MLA.
Absolutely. And I mean, I read through it prior to the interview today, and I was highlighting different things. And, you know, it just, perhaps I'm biased, but I've tried to approach everything regarding this state that we're in from an analysis of the evidence that I was able to find. And I tried to look at both sides of the argument, and I tried to apply a common sense approach. And when I look at your Magna Carta document, there's nothing in there that would be considered unreasonable, right? Like it's all like, these are very practical solutions. And I think that's what people need to invest their time and energy in, is advocating for practical solutions that the entire population, or the vast majority of the population, could get behind, as opposed to try and reinvent the wheel with a novel approach that,
which is very difficult to do. And I think this is one of the places where Alberta has fallen down on the side, because, you know, a lot of the Alberta politicians have been on our side on this for many, many years, right? They have seen the faults in the system, but there are ways to make the system more accountable, right? And I mean, the other one is, I think, Danny, which really is important, is that if Canada is to remain a sovereign nation, you cannot go signing international trade agreements or any other agreements which in any way impair or impede us as a sovereign nation.
Well, like the most recent example would be the WHO, the pending WHO pandemic management treaty. But you know, what was just occurring was a change or amendment to international health regulations, and fortunately, it didn't. I don't think it passed, because a lot of African nations dug in and said
primarily because, by the way, not because Canada opposed it, because Canada supported it, not because the US did. Who was it that stopped the WHO from going ahead and making these amendments? Africa and South America.
Which
it wasn't the enlightened democratic countries of Western Europe and North America which stopped this incursion into national sovereignty. It was places like Brazil and many countries in Africa, because they have been so overwhelmed with China and Russia and the United States telling them what to do and putting conditions on any foreign aid that goes to them, diminishing their sovereignty, that they recognized an evil thing when they saw it.
Well, I think they've lived it. They've experienced. They probably have. They have far more. I perceive that they have had far more experience with what you refer to as the four horsemen, right? Like,
exactly.
Big government, big press, big pharma, and big tech. Like,
Right.
And when you listen to Matthias Desmet, that interview I was mentioning earlier, the mass formation, he specifically outlines how there was an author, I think it was Hannah Arendt, back in like the 51.
Fantastic author.
Predicted
Yes.
the next totalitarian regime would be a technocracy. Yes. Is that the right term?
Yes.
You know, where and I think that's when you think about what we're currently sitting under, with like the mainstream media being so biased and like an arm of the federal government or an arm of the government, and the social media censorship and algorithms that are just constantly feeding the echo chamber, it's no wonder that the mass formation has taken hold.
And one of the great dangers is that we think we wait for a WHO to incur upon some health jurisdiction, and not realizing, because we haven't been at the wheel, that has already happened in the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. Mm-hmm. We didn't have to wait for the World Health Organization incursion to see how our sovereignty was being impacted. Trump got out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement because it was going to impact the sovereignty of the United States. We stayed in. So it's already happened. The erosion is already happening, even without the World Health Organization getting more power. That's what we don't recognize. There's an insidious stuff going on day by day that we don't recognize. It's only because it was the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization being highlighted because of the pandemic. Yeah. Meanwhile, before and while and during and now, while all that stuff is being happening, and we're focused just on the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum, we're forgetting that there's negotiations going on every day for additional trade agreements, which are going to erode our sovereignty as a nation. Welcome to the world of, right? The new world your eyes got to be on the ball every day, not just what some group highlights, but you've got to be on the ball every day, because it's happening all the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Every day through our trade agreements.
I think something that I'm really looking forward to, I've committed to being with James Topp for his final march and supporting the Canada Day celebration with him.
Right.
And after that, I've decided I'm going to switch off social media, and I'm just going to communicate by email predominantly, or with my trusted circle of people, because
that's what I'm doing now.
It's such a time vampire. It takes up all of your time and mental energy.
I'm not on any social media.
I wasn't before all of this. And
I'm not, never was, never will be.
Yeah.
I have a flip cell phone that's only on when I leave the house, so that the wife can get hold of me, or I can get hold of her.
Well, that's I think that's a wise decision. And I think those smartphones that everyone carries around in their pockets are a big reason why we have become so complacent and easy to manipulate.
No question. Yeah. Yep. You flip in to get the headlines as if that's the news.
Yep, that's it. All right. Well, closing thought, I just want to reaffirm to people, check out your blog, Peckford42 at wordpress.com.
.wordpress.com.
.wordpress.com.
And it's Peckford #4 and #2.
#2, that's right.
Peckford #4 and #2. That's the year I was born, 1942. Peckford42.wordpress.com.
That's amazing. Well, and they can find your Magna Carta there for real world applicable solutions that we can start pushing towards right now.
Today.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate your time. It was my absolute distinct pleasure to speak with you today.
And pleasure to be with you, sir, as it is always. And good luck at the Ottawa Canada Day celebrations and the Mr. Topp, because I'm very supportive of what he and all of us are trying to do on that score. Yeah. You have a wonderful day.
I will. You as well, sir. Thank you very much.